special partnership with and brought to you by our friends at FLYN. Today at Soulfront, we have Todd Hirsch, who's the chief economist for ATB Financial with us. We go into a conversation about COVID-19, the pandemic, and how it impacts vulnerable populations. Todd is a published author. He is a regular contributor to the Globe and Mail. But Todd's passion is looking at economics and bringing it to life through story. So we really want to dive into the idea of how COVID-19 has impacted vulnerable populations and see where's this going, what's happening, and what do we need to do to change it. So without further ado, let's get into the show. Todd, thank you so much. Welcome to the show. I really appreciate you coming on and taking the time.
Great to be.
Todd, you're the chief economist of ATB Financial. You're a columnist at the Globe and Mail and an author. So a lot of experience communicating. And what we wanted to talk about today for our topic is the idea of the COVID crisis and how it's punishing vulnerable populations. But before we go into that, I just wanted to ask a different question. I know that bringing economics to life through story has been a passion of yours. Can you explain what that means to you?
Yeah, well, I guess I was heavily influenced years ago by listening to an economist speak. Actually, he's not so much an economist. He's a journalist and a writer, Daniel Pink, an American writer. And he was giving a speech here in Calgary. And he was able to walk us through his entire speech using two things, image and story. And it really impacted me, the power of both of those. And it changed the way forever I think about presenting, because I can still see some of those images that he used, almost probably 10 or 12 years after the fact. And I can still remember some of the stories he told. And the more I've learned about story, and I have some very good friends who are experts in storytelling and the power of story, that's what people remember. In fact, there's a little trick that speakers will use sometimes when they tell you, I want to tell you a story. The minute people hear that word story, we are conditioned. Our brain starts to work in a different way, and you've got people's attention in a much different way than if you said, I want to present some statistics. So even just hearing that word story, that a story is coming, you engage with the audience in a very, very different way, in a powerful way if you're a good storyteller. And people remember story. That's why I love using it.
Do you remember a time where you first felt that you were able to make an impact and that it was valuable in that space through storytelling?
I guess so. Coming out of the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, that's when my presentation style changed. And I used a metaphor that people today, still 12 years later, they come up to me and they say, I remember you telling that story. And the story was, I was talking about asset-backed commercial paper and all these distressed mortgages and why it was so difficult and I used a metaphor. I used the story of an apple farmer who would bring an enormous crate or enormous trailer of apples to the market. And I had a picture of a giant trailer full of apples. And the problem was there was a funny smell coming from the apples. The apples looked okay, but once you started to dig through some of the apples, you realized that a few were rotten. And it took a long time to take all the apples out and figure out which ones were the rotten apples. And that really sums up the problem in the US mortgage market way back in 2008 and 2009, because they had no idea how to value the entire crate of apples until they went through one by one and separated the good from the bad. So I think it was only because people have told me 12 years later, they still remember that image of the apple cart and they still remember the story. I think that was one that sort of stands out, an early story that I started to use and tell.
Yeah, and actually, I think that's a great segue into our topic, which is how vulnerable populations are being severely impacted by COVID, and not just understanding that, but realizing kind of the larger impacts of it. Like, there's a quote that I have here by Damien Barr through Twitter, and it's you know, we're not all in the same boat. We're in the same storm. Some are in yachts and some are in boats with one oar.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you hear a quote like that, like, what do you make of it?
Oh, I saw that same quote. In fact, the one I saw, it's probably all from sort of the same source, but one said, some are clinging to bits of driftwood. We are not, we are in this storm together, but we are all in different situations. And that really struck home when I heard that, or when I read that quote, because even before COVID, income inequality was something, as an economist, I'm quite concerned about. Not entirely certain how we address it. I mean, I think that we have some options, but it's the reason we're seeing a lot of turmoil and a lot of political stress and a lot of really nasty things happening around the world right now is because not everyone is succeeding. Neoliberalism, this idea that the global economy, and we tear down trade barriers and we globalize everything. Over the last 50 or 70 years, that really has, there's no question, it has enriched nations around the world. The world is a better place in terms of GDP. The problem is not every individual has been a beneficiary of that. Many people are doing very well in the global economy, but millions of others are not doing well at all. They are not keeping up. They are feeling threatened. They're feeling angry by globalization. And it leads to some potentially very unpleasant political outcomes. We're seeing the rise of nationalism, the rise of populism. I don't want to get too far into the weeds on this, but leaders like Donald Trump and what's happened in the United Kingdom and what's happening in countries like Brazil and India, all around the world, people who are the most vulnerable and have not been keeping up with globalization, they are angry and they are calling for some radical change. And then you can start to see some really dark alleys, because I don't want to make too much of this. I know it's upsetting to people, but you go back to the 1920s in Germany, and it was exactly that. The German people felt they were not keeping up. And along comes a leader who tells them all we need to do is, purify our race. An absolute nightmare, a nightmare that, we cannot forget about. And we're starting to see shades of it happening again today. And a lot of the roots of it are because of income inequality.
Now, if we look at the different types of groups, like I pulled an article from The Guardian, and it just tried to break down like who these people, like what the workforce looks like right now and how people are being affected. So like there's 4 different groups. So one was the remotes, and these are the professional managerial group that were about 35% of the workforce. Another were the essentials, and they're about 30%. That's nurses, home care, childcare workers, those types of folks. The unpaid, which are basically people who have been laid off or furloughed, and that's about 25%. And that's reaching Great Depression levels.
Yeah.
And then the forgotten, like the folks who are in prisons, jails, undocumented immigrants, people who are working in camps of migrant farm workers,
Homeless population.
yeah. So who like when we're talking about vulnerable populations, who are we talking about?
Well, I guess especially the last 3 categories that you talked about, and as the categories went, from category 2 to 4, they become more and more vulnerable. And it's that category 1 of people, and I admit I'm one of those people. We talk, everyone's working from home during COVID. In fact, it's only they estimate about 25% of Canadian workers even can work from home. And we have to understand it's a hardship in a lot of ways, for sure. People are trying to manage, remote working. They're trying to manage homeschooling, which is new, and it can be very stressful. I get it, but it's the people who have no ability to work from home. Those essential workers you're talking about, the healthcare workers, the frontline workers, they are the ones that, in a lot of ways, we are making most exposed to the virus. So that's got to be an added stress for them right away. They don't have, in some ways, the luxury to just stay home. They have to be out doing their job on site. So they're vulnerable because we've put them in a spot where, in fact, they're more susceptible to contracting the virus. Then category three, the laid off workers, the furloughed workers, they're economically vulnerable because while they were employed or, potentially are employed, they don't know how long this is going to go on. A loss of income, a huge stress for people, absolutely. And then that fourth category, the forgottens. This is the saddest situation of all. People who, even pre-COVID, they just did not fit in anywhere. They had income, if any income at all. I was in New York City in February before the outbreak of COVID. And purposely, I was there for a week on a vacation. And purposely, I wanted to ride the subway because I wanted to see what it was like. I didn't get in any Ubers. I didn't get any taxi cabs, even though I could have. I wanted to see what it was like getting around Manhattan for a week on the subway. Two things struck me. For one thing, the subway is a really efficient way to get around Manhattan, especially when there's traffic. But the other thing that struck me is it's an entirely different world, 40 feet under the pavement. Most of the people on the subway are these forgottens. Many of them, some of them would have jobs. They'd be those ones that would be unemployed now, but many were just sort of clinging to driftwood in life. They were not concerned about climate change. They're not concerned about the state of US media, all of these other topics that people above ground are talking about. They're trying to figure out, how do I get through this day alive? And that's what really struck me. And you see it in cities like New York in ways you don't see it like that in Calgary or, Edmonton or a Canadian city. So it struck me that way. That fourth category of people, the forgottens, some of the saddest examples right there.
Yeah, I've seen in media and the contrast where you have celebrities, speaking from their mansions, or politicians eating ice cream and talking about how tough it is, and it is stark where there's real life consequences going on. In terms of the ramifications, there's the mental health ramifications, there are the health ramifications, there's the economic ramifications of not doing enough for these vulnerable populations. What are we doing, right now? And, what do you think is going to happen if we don't take a serious enough look at this?
Well, there's lots of negative things. Depending on the different countries and different societies, they'll have different, tolerances for income inequality. Some countries, they're perfectly happy with billionaires and homeless people living, sort of side by side. Other countries, the Scandinavian nations, the more socialist kind of nations, they aren't comfortable with that sort of inequality at all. Canada, I'd say we're kind of in the middle ground. We do tolerate income inequality, but at a certain level, I think it makes most Canadians uncomfortable, more so than maybe our American friends. But if we ignore this too long, then we do start to see social harmony breaking down, societal instability. We start to see potentially the rise of political movements that are, can be at some points quite extreme, advocating some maybe very violent or very upsetting things. Again, we just need to look through the history of the 20th century and the 19th century to see what happens, in fact, when neglected populations are just kind of left to their own. Bad things are going to happen. So, there's more to it than just saying we need to be nice to people, which I think we do need to be nice to people. But for those, if that's not a good enough argument, our democratic society requires a certain amount of buy-in from all the population. And when you have a segment of the population that is no longer feeling like they're a participant in this game at all, that's when you can anticipate some very, very extreme challenges to the existing system. And we have to question, do we value income, or do we value our economic and societal stability? And we need to think about that.
Yeah, in terms of what's being done right now in Canada and in the States, and in Alberta. Like, would you see that we're playing it as we go and not going all in, or in terms of trying to help vulnerable populations or even just the economy in general? Like, where do you see our kind of our kickback reaction to what's been happening?
Yeah. Well, I guess we can talk about pre-COVID and then maybe during COVID and then think about post-COVID. Pre-COVID, already, a lot of conversations, especially by economists, talking about things like a universal basic income. One of the Democrat nominees, Andrew Yang, he was running on a platform in the United States of a universal basic income. Now, the fact that he dropped out of the race pretty early is maybe telling, but still, here we had a major contestant for the Democrat nomination talking about a universal basic income. So already, I would say the last 5 or 10 years pre-COVID, there was bubbling to the surface this conversation about how are we going to address income inequality? Is there a better way to do it than the 80-year-old system that we've had here in Canada of social welfare, of income support, cobbled together all these different programs over many decades? Does that really make sense anymore? Is that really the best we can do? Or do we need to rethink? And those conversations, they didn't really get very far, but people were starting to have them. Then COVID hit. Very immediately, the federal government basically rolls out a universal basic income, the CERB, the Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit, which in a lot of ways resembles a universal basic income. They're saying, we're not going to ask you too many questions. I mean, the questions will come later. There'll be audits at tax time, blah, blah, blah. But if you need money, here's how do you apply for it. And bam, here's $2,000 into your bank account. Basically, an emergency response with the idea that if we don't do something for people right now, we are going to have societal collapse and economic collapse and catastrophe. And I think, there's been critics of it for sure, especially some of the details around it. But, I haven't seen, even the opposition parties, I haven't seen them in a wholesale way saying this is the wrong thing to do. I think people have understood in a crisis, this is what you have to do. Now we can think about post-COVID. Do we keep some sort of CERB in place for a while longer? Are we maybe in that way easing into something that resembles a universal basic income? I don't know. My guess is we won't because it's still a pretty radical idea. But I think we've at least opened the conversation in a broader way in Canada, how we can rethink our system of income support, addressing not even maybe the very most vulnerable in our society, but that category you mentioned, people who have been laid off, who have been furloughed, who have no income at the moment.
Yeah, in terms of the impact, like where we are on the ground in Alberta, Alberta's lost is around $250,000 or 250,000 jobs. Our unemployment rate is around 13.4%. We're expected for the economy to contract by about 5.8%. These are just numbers that I've looked at recently, and they've probably changed. But when you look at something that is this large, it begs the question, like, this is the time for policy change. There's no other time. So yeah. Like, how do we gather momentum to make the right changes? What is it sitting back and looking at other governments and what they're doing, or is there something different that we need to do?
It's a great question, and I'm just as curious as everybody. When we come out of COVID, and my guess is that will probably be sometime in the fall or maybe even early next year when we can finally say, okay, this is behind us. And then level our heads, start to talk about what did we learn from the pandemic? How can we improve our system? I'm hopeful that nobody would just say, we just need to go back to the way we used to do it. I'm hopeful that everybody, even though there's going to be disagreement on what it looks like, that we all can agree, okay, there are changes that we need to make. If, in fact, when there might be another pandemic, we need to be more prepared in terms of our system of income support. So how can we start to redesign that? Now, that is where there's going to be a lot of fighting and a lot of arguing. We tend not to argue as much during a crisis, like when we're right in the middle of it. But after people feel more, secure and the pandemic's behind us, that is when there'll be a lot of arguing and disagreement. Where those arguments and debates and discussions go, I'm hopeful that we can move towards something that makes more sense. I'm on the fence, to be perfectly honest, about a universal basic income. I see benefits, but drawbacks of it for sure. I do think we need to look at other examples. Spain is now introducing a universal basic income. That, I think, will provide a lot of information and a lot of learnings as to how it works and maybe how we can design one to mitigate against the worst impacts of it. So I think it's a combination of all those things. Learning how to debate and discuss the ways going forward, learning from other countries and other examples, but ultimately putting together something that makes sense going forward.
When you talked before about the 2008 financial crisis, and you had with the mortgage situation where we had basically these apples, you're saying, where there were good apples and bad apples, and that was kind of the analogy that you were using to say, hey, we should have recognized a problem happening because some of those apples didn't smell too good.
Right.
Is there an analogy right now that you're trying to form in terms of how do you explain this story? What is this story, and where is the story going?
Yeah, it's a good question. I haven't given too much thought to it, but getting back to the story or that Twitter quote you kind of started with earlier, we're not in the same boat, we're in the same storm. Even telling that, some are in yachts, some are in rowboats, some are clinging to driftwood, even that is kind of a story. It generates in people's minds a very stark image. And that image, I think, describes pretty well what's happening. And most people, when they hear that, it resonates with them because now they're thinking about this in terms of image and story, not just statistics. So it might be that story that maybe I expand on a little bit more. But I don't know if I have in mind right at the moment what the story is going to look like. But I know I will. One thing I do know about story and about inspiration and about creativity is that it kind of hits you, and you have to be aware when it's going to hit you. It might happen while you're watching a TV show. It might happen in a conversation with a friend on a video call. You never know when that idea is going to arrive and hit, but it will.
Mm-hmm. And just for final thoughts, Todd, what do you think leaders can do to help our most vulnerable population?
It's a great question. I think the best thing leaders can do, and again, we're not all going to agree on everything, but the best thing leaders can do is be willing to say, we need a rethink here. Sometimes in Canada, I don't know if this is a criticism of us or not, but, we tend to be quite small c conservative in that we don't really like a lot of big change happening. It tends to be very incremental with little fixes here and there, duct tapes on the plumbing system, trying to, keep the existing system going. And, in a lot of ways, we've done pretty well as a country, better than a lot of other places around the world, for sure. But for our leaders of any political stripe, of any level of government or organization, I think the best thing we can do is have a willingness to say, okay, we need a bigger redo on this. COVID has given us an opportunity. I mean, it's been nasty and terrible and tragic, but in some ways, this might have been the bucket of cold water in the face that we needed as a province, maybe as a country, to say, there are things you can be doing much better. Now here's your chance to take a pause. You've been shocked out of your sleepwalking state. Here is your opportunity for a rethink of how you can redo things like our system of social welfare, maybe even our rethink of the Canadian energy industry altogether. All kinds of things that we needed to be maybe shocked out of our state of sleepwalking. And that's what our leaders can do.
Yeah. And I also think, and I appreciate you wanting to go into this topic. I think that we're in it together, and we have to be open-eyed to the things that are happening around us and the people who are suffering. And by digging into those stories and those issues, hopefully we can come out better and stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we will. And one of the things most of us have been seeing during the COVID times is even a greater appreciation and understanding of what community is all about. I'm hopeful that that will be one of the things that strengthens. And when I say community, that can be any kind of community. It can be your geographic neighborhood. It can be a faith community, a business community, but the idea that we need to rely on each other more strongly. I'm reading a book right now, and I'll be quick with this. It's called The Third Pillar. And the subtitle is how markets and government have left community behind. And it's an economist who wrote the book. He used to head up the IMF, used to head up the Central Bank of India. But he's basically saying we can't demonize the market system and capitalism. Our society actually requires that. However, when the market system and capitalism becomes too dominant, too strong, things get out of balance, like income inequality. We can't demonize too much government. We need government. We need rules and regulations and enforcement of that. But again, when government becomes overpowering or too dominant, things are out of balance. But then he talks about that third pillar being community. And that's the one that maybe over the last century has been a bit neglected, at least in North American culture. The one that we need to reinvigorate and maybe rediscover the power of community, and bringing all three of those pillars into balance. And I'm hopeful that's where we're going in the post-COVID world, and I'm starting to see some encouraging signs of it.
Todd, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate you chatting with me.
It's been a real pleasure, Scotty. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much. Thank you for your support. Please remember to click subscribe so we can bring you more remarkable interviews with extraordinary leaders.